take it back. This is a good part. Ice. New babies alone cannot change the designs of fate, and no one knew, not even Gwendolyn, the drama that lay just ahead for Stumpy and for all of the animals in Gooseberry Park. The park had known its share of danger. The animals had lived through drought and the specter of a dying river. They had watched a tornado take a few trees down from the south side one spring. There had been deep snow and lightning and the threat of a boy with an air rifle. But what they were about to face was a danger none of them could have imagined. When just before dawn the freezing rain began to fall, Gwendolyn, looking out Professor Albert's window, knew that a day of trouble had arrived. Morning came, and the steady pick, pick, pick of icy pellets against the house Professor Albert and Kona and Gwendolyn at the window, their faces full of concern. And as the day wore on and the ice thickened, the earth all around them began to suffer. Ice dropped from the sky and covered everything. It coated houses, swing sets, street lights, telephone wires. It encased picnic tables, cars, fences, trains, and it froze trees. The trees were first wet and cold and slick. Then the slickness hardened and became ice. And the ice grew thicker and thicker and heavier, and soon the trees began to bow their weary limbs until finally the limbs snapped, crashing to the ground. The sap froze in other trees and exploded with a sound like gunpowder as they fell. Professor Albert had just planted a pink dogwood and a small flowering crabapple in a ginkgo tree. All three were too young to withstand the assault of the ice, and during the course of the afternoon they dropped one by one. Professor Albert had tried to run out and throw a quilt over the ginkgo, but he fell down his front steps and slid all the way to the mailbox. Kona stood at the door and barked and barked. The professor hobbled back into his house, muttering that he should have moved to Florida with all the other retired professors. He fixed himself a cup of hot Darjeeling tea, and then, sore and exhausted, promptly went to sleep. He slept so soundly, tucked under a knitted throw on his living room sofa, that even the loudest snap of falling branches didn't stir him. Kona and Gwendolyn were left to do all of the worrying. And of course, it was not the fate of ginkgo trees that had them knotted up inside. It was the fate of their small squirrel friend and her newborn children. No one could have guessed which trees in Gooseberry Park would stand through the storm and which trees would fall. No one could have guessed that an old ash tree over by the river would bend and groan and suffer under the weight of the ice, but would hold steady, and that other stronger, sturdier trees, oak trees, would break. When the storm began, Stumpy had burrowed herself and her babies under the thick blanket of twigs and leaves in her nest to keep dry, as she always did in the rain. But when the rain had become ice, persistently tapping against the leaf blanket, still Stumpy had not been afraid. She had endured sleet, and a little fine ice on the trees was no worry to her. But when the leaf blanket grew heavier and heavier with its freezing weight, and a deep, cold chill that she could not warm began to run through Stumpy's body, and as the air filled with the groans and agonizing cracks of trees falling under, the little red squirrel became very, very afraid. Had she been alone, she would have fled her nest and gone to a safe underground burrow. But Stumpy was not alone. She had 3 babies whose eyes were barely open and whose bodies were still pink in places where the fur had not yet grown in. Babies who could not be moved in a deluge of icy rain without great risk. Stumpy drew the 3 babies more tightly under her body and tried to calm their whimperings each time a dying tree cracked like thunder on its way down. She wondered how Murray was, if he was as frightened as she, if he also was wishing for the comfort of company. Under the weight of the ice, she could not call to him. She hoped he was safe wherever he was, and she tried to cheer herself up by imagining him trapped in the Chinese dumpster under the ice with a week's worth of egg rolls. And it was when she was thinking of him and smiling to herself that a kind of explosion sounded in her ears, and her world lost its balance and went falling to the cold, hard ground. Oh, and there's the next one.